So let me say a bit about what I'm going to try and do just in the next quarter of an hour. So the first thing I'm going to try and do is just draw attention to two themes that have been quite prevalent over the past 25 years or so, which I think are in tension. So one is this widespread ethical consensus that there are very strong moral reasons and distinctive moral reasons not to touch germline DNA, particularly in humans. The other one is a theme that Stefan was talking about right at the beginning, the growing view, although certainly not shared by all, that inheritance isn't just about germline DNA. I want to suggest those are in tension. And having laid out those tensions, I'm then going to try to ask three questions briefly. The first is whether all interventions that have the potential to affect multiple generations should be thought of as on a par from an ethical perspective. The second question is whether or not UK legislation is unwittingly committed to some kind of empirical bet that epigenetic inheritance isn't very important. And the third question I'm going to ask is whether or not from ethical analysis, this whole notion of the germline should just disappear as irrelevant in the context of that analysis. And I'm going to suggest that the answers to those questions, roughly speaking, are no, I don't know, and yes. Okay, so this will be familiar, I think, to most people. Over the past, as I say, 25 years or so, we've seen repeated thoughts that the germline, particularly germline DNA, is something that cannot be meddled with or altered in any way ethically. So here's an example. Back in October 2015, the IBC, the International Bioethics Committee of UNESCO, updated some earlier reflections it had made on the human genome. And it said this, and this of course was in the light of worries coming out at that time about the potential for using CRISPR-Cas9 for editing the genome. We're humans, they say, because of the interplay of many biological, historical and cultural determinants. Of course, this rather suggests an extended view of inheritance. And they say these preserve the feeling of our fundamental unity and nourish the richness of our diversity. And then they say this is why the human genome is one of the premises of freedom itself, not simply raw material to manipulate at leisure. And then they conclude interventions on the human genome should be admitted only for preventive, diagnostic or therapeutic reasons, and without enacting modifications for descendants. So no germline interventions. And you can find numerous other international organizations who view this notion of germline modification in a similarly dim ethical light. Why is it wrong to alter the germline? Well, different people will give slightly different reasons, but this from the NIH in the US isn't that unusual. So again, April 2015, many communications came out around about the same time. They said the strong arguments against engaging in germline modification remain. These include serious and unquantifiable safety issues, ethical issues presented by altering the germline in a way that affects the next generation without their consent, and a current lack of compelling medical applications justifying the use of CRISPR-Cas9 in embryos. So in sum, many international organizations lining up to say that we should keep our hands off the germline and expressing what appears to be a very particular kind of ethical disapproval of those interventions. So that's one theme. Now, at the same time, there have also been a number of theorists, often with an interest in evolutionary theory, but not only with an interest in evolutionary theory, who actually over a similar period, so Stefan mentioned Eva Jablonka and Marianne Lamb's work dating back to the mid-90s, over again a 25-year period or so, people arguing for this expanded or extended view of inheritance. And so this is just one example, again from 2015, at exactly the same time as all those comments on CRISPR-Cas9 were coming out. This is from a paper by Kevin Leyland and colleagues that will be known to some of you at least. One of their big papers arguing for what they call an extended evolutionary synthesis, and that paper has many, many themes, but one of them is for a notion of inclusive inheritance. So they say inheritance extends beyond genes to encompass transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, physiological inheritance, ecological inheritance, social or behavioral transmission, and cultural inheritance. And then they go on to make some points about acquired characters. So there are a lot more ways then, on the face of things, that you can intervene in the makeup of future generations beyond fiddling around with germline DNA. And here's their big list. And as I say, not everybody agrees with that either. Okay, now put these things together and you can see that there are at least some tensions or some sources of discomfort. So you might think, well, should we treat all interventions that affect multiple generations on a par, at least from the perspective of moral and ethical analysis? And the reason why you might think that is because when you look back to what the NIH said, for example, about why it's bad to try to edit germline DNA, their worries were all completely generic. They were to do with the lack of informed consent on the part of future individuals. They were to do with a certain level of risk and uncertainty about exactly what these interventions might achieve. But the point is that those worries seem to apply all the time. They apply to any method of altering what might happen downstream for future generations. Those future generations can never consent. We're always uncertain. And so what that means is that if people like Kevin Leyland and co are right to suggest that there are many, many forms of inheritance, then it looks as though all of those different forms of inheritance are bound to just inherit the very same worries that the NIH brings to germline, to editing of germline DNA. Because whenever we intervene in a way that affects future generations, those future people can't consent. The medical rationale will often be uncertain, and as is always the case, we never quite know the risks for sure. Here's another question that arises when you combine, on the one hand, the ethical opprobrium heaped on germline DNA interventions, and the notion that maybe instead inheritance should be understood in a more expanded way. And the question, as I'm putting it here, is whether UK legislation, for example, is maybe without knowing it, putting a fairly big empirical bet on transgenerational germline epigenetic inheritance being relatively unimportant. So here's why I say this, and this is a genuine question on my part, because I'm not a medical lawyer, and I very much welcome feedback from people who do have more knowledge of the law. So here's what the HFEA Act says. It only allows what are called permitted eggs and permitted sperm to be used for reproductive purposes. And when you look at the definitions, a permitted egg, for example, is defined as one which has been produced by or extracted from the ovaries of a woman, so no artificial eggs. And it's also one whose nuclear or mitochondrial DNA has not been altered. And my assumption is that the reason why nuclear or mitochondrial DNA is prohibited from alteration is supposed to be partly a way of preventing germline interventions. But note that because it's only DNA that's specified here, it doesn't appear, at least, that the alteration of other molecules is ruled out. In other words, that legislation seems to presuppose that what's sometimes called epigenome editing doesn't have transgenerational effects, because if it did, then on the face of things, we should be just as worried about that as we are about the alteration of nuclear or mitochondrial DNA. Here's a third question. Should this whole notion of the germline disappear as a concept that really carries kind of distinctive or salient moral weight? So here are some reasons that might suggest that it should, or at least that we should be wary of using this notion of the germline in ethical analysis without a lot of hedging. So if the reason why we're worried about intervening in the germline is because germline interventions, unlike somatic interventions, have the ability to affect many, many people, Well, they're certainly not the only interventions that have that feature. Many public health measures also have, as we know very well right now, public health measures also can have extremely broad ranging effects. They may simultaneously affect many individuals from many generations all at the same time in ways whose then further downstream effects may be unpredictable. But this is exactly the kind of thing we're worried about right now. Public health measures also can sometimes persist across multiple generations after initial enactment. And I'm thinking in part about parallels with ways of thinking about inheritance in general here. Educational campaigns can have sustained effects because of forms of social learning, for example, being passed down generations. Other kinds of public health interventions might be affected through massive infrastructural change, maybe through building of systems of sanitation, which again are going to stick around for longer than a single generation, going back to some of Stefan's comments about environmental inheritance here. And because they stick around for longer than a single generation, they too can affect more than one generation. So there are many, many other cases where we have on the face of things very similar worries about these knock-on effects over multiple generations. And as I say, these certainly aren't the only ways of doing this. Those people who are enthusiasts for what's sometimes called expanded inheritance or extended inheritance will also point to, least controversially, of course, mitochondrial inheritance, more controversially, transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. Perhaps also some people would say the importance of transmission of inherited symbionts, many, many potential ways of affecting future generations. In all of these cases, it doesn't matter how we're intervening to affect future generations. We're always cautious about the prospect of interventions which might have effects that ripple through many individuals, either because they are transmitted from one individual to the next, or simply because they simultaneously affect many individuals at once. And in many cases, they will indeed have uncertain impacts that we might struggle to control. It seems to me in the light of that, that instead of asking a very kind of blunt question, does the intervention affect the germline or not? Instead, we can ask a series of questions which are simultaneously more focused in the content they have and also more general in the application. And that might sound paradoxical, but what I mean is that we can ask much more specific things about each of these interventions. And we can ask them in a way that allows that question to be applied not just to, say, a genetic intervention, but many, many other interventions that have the potential to affect numerous generations. So we can ask, what does our intervention aim to achieve? What are the risks of that intervention? Does the technique or intervention that we're proposing maybe have very specific features that carry idiosyncratic ethical worries? And are there better alternatives? Are there simply easier or better ways of achieving the same ends? So just to kind of briefly close by giving you a sense of the way in which we might ask those kinds of questions for a specific case, let's take the case of pronuclear transfer. So as I think many of you will probably know, this is one of the techniques that was made legal again in 2015 in the UK for the prevention of the inheritance across multiple generations of mitochondrial disease. What does this intervention aim to achieve? One important ethical question to ask. Well, it allows women with mitochondrial disease to have children who are genetically related to them and grandchildren too. And for some people, that is an ethically important thing to do, and for others, it's not. And so partly asking what the aim is simply helps us kind of clarify what's at stake here. What are the risks? There are many potential risks that were evaluated in the context of these technologies. Just to give you one example, one of the more controversial areas of risk was whether or not there might be adverse interactions between mitochondrial and nuclear genomes. HFEA panels considered those things at some length. Are there specific features of this technique that bring very idiosyncratic ethical worries compared with other ways of affecting future generations? Well, in the case of PNT, yes, because 3 genetic donors are involved, and that's why the press had enormous fun referring to this as a 3-parent IVF technique. And are there better alternatives or alternatives that can achieve similar ends, but maybe at lower risk? Well, in some cases there are. It looks as though PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, can also achieve similar ends here. However, the case was made that there were some individuals for whom PGD wouldn't work. And so partly consistent, I think, with this general framework I'm suggesting here, the HFEA said that PNT should first of all only be offered to patients for whom PGD wouldn't work, for whom it wouldn't be appropriate, or for whom it would be unlikely to succeed. So let's just give you a flavor of the way in which we can use, on the face of things, some very general questions to kind of pull out some, I think really rather kind of helpful ethical analysis in these contexts. So just to summarize, I'm not proposing that we should say all modes of intervention that affect future generations are on a par, morally speaking. Once we've made the move to extended inheritance, we should see that any method of affecting future generations should be placed in exactly the same category as an intervention to affect germline DNA. That would simply smooth over a too much valuable ethical texture. But I do want to say that when we ask about the ethical standing of the whole gamut of interventions that might affect future generations, it seems to me we're better off asking that series of rather focused questions about risk and medical rationale, rather than asking what in some ways is I think, an overly blunt question, which is, does it affect the germline or not? In case you want a bit of further reading, so part of what I've talked about today is based on a recent paper of mine called Blurring the Germline from the journal Bioethics. And I've also drawn a little in these reflections on some work by Brian Quick in a paper that's going to be coming out very soon in American Journal of Bioethics called Revising, Correcting and Transferring Genes. But there I'll stop. Thank you.